Hello once again, and in this tutorial, as promised, we're going to change our spheres into snakes. And as you can see, I've already prepared some snakes and got those on the screen there. We just take a close look at them. Okay, so we've got our 5 snakes and their names are Sid, Nancy, Bonnie, Clyde and Dave, as in Rodney. And if you don't quite get the joke, Google only fools and horses and have a look at a character called Trigger. Anyway, moving on from there. So we'll just have a quick look at the structure of Sid here. So it starts with a subdivision surface, and then I've got a connect object which is essential for this to work, and then all the various parts of my snake are in there. We'll have a little look at how I've constructed a snake a little bit later on, just a brief look. It's not a modelling tutorial, but we'll have a brief look at the way they're put together. So I've got my snake, I've got my eyes, which started out as hemispheres and then were put together in there. The tongue, which started out as a simple cube. Spline wrap here. The spline at the bottom, spline number 3 here, is in that particular spline wrap to wrap the tongue around. So that's what that's for. And then the all essential part of this is the spline wrap here. This is the spline that the actual snake will move along as it slithers across the screen. So if we go down here, I've got snake splines. If I make those visible and then go into our top view, we can see the spline paths that they're going to move along. As you can see, each one has its own individual style. I mean, the idea here was to give each snake a different personality from all the others. That was the basic thought there, just to give them a little bit of character, really. So that explains the idea behind the spline shapes. I've used Bezier splines, which I've left adaptive. I haven't done anything clever with them. All of them start from the same point at the back of the snake here, and they finish at the same point over here. They're not all going to be exactly the same length, but that's irrelevant because it's controlled by the spline wrap's offset here. So as the snakes, or the offset, goes from 0 to 100%, the snakes are going to move to the same points along the splines regardless anyway, so there's no bias in it. That's what I'm saying there, really. Okay, so that's that part of the tutorial explained. So what we can do, if I just go into a new window here, just briefly, what I did with the snake body is I started off with a cylinder, put it into +X there, and I had 8 rotation segments, and I think I used 8 height segments. Probably take it down a little bit in the radius, maybe about 20, and perhaps about 100 in length. Make the thing editable, go into points, select everything, and then optimize, because we don't want the cap separate from the body of the cylinder there. Just zoom in on the object, and then all I did is just a classic case of getting a hold of vertices and moving them around. So we just go to the other side, and then all I did to start forming the mouth, just grabbed that there and pushed it in. And then it was a case of getting a hold of the points at the top here, pushing those downwards. And you can see now that these are going to be where the eye sockets are. We've already got that on its way down to form the mouth. Probably a good idea to just get these 2 here and drop those down a little bit further, not too much though. So we've got that idea going there. Switch to polygon mode, and then I just selected these 2 polygons, did an inner extrude on them, and I took it down by probably about, I think, 1 centimetre. Don't want preserve groups on. Same thing with the extrude, I just went minus, I think, 5. Pushed those back into there to create the eye sockets. At this point I dropped it into a subdivision surface, and as you can see, it's starting to form that sort of reptile sort of shape for the snake there. If we grab a hold of these 2 polygons here, I'll just do a quick extrude on those of, I think, probably about 1 centimetre, just to give it a little bit of extra depth there. And then I'm able to go back into points and drag this upwards to give a little bit more depth here. Pull this one downwards, not too far though. And then the whole thing I can grab a hold of this here, pull it forwards and drop it down. So we're starting to get that snake-like sort of, or cartoon snake-like nose that the snakes often have. And then it's a case of doing a similar job with the bottom of it. Grabbing hold of these points, it's probably best to do a loop selection on this. UL, that's it. And then we just need to scale those down in the Y and the Z. And then the same deal with all of it, so that you just taper it down until it becomes a snake. And there's a case of probably moving these inwards to get them slightly behind the head, and then manipulating this loop here behind the head to draw it out a little bit. And you can see that it gradually forms the shape. I mean, I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on this, but this is essentially how I did it. And then I said I've got a couple of hemispheres, manipulated those into the correct shapes and dropped them into the eye sockets there. And then I moved on and built the tongue, which, as I said, was a very, very simple shape that I've formed into a forked tongue, and then dropped a spline wrap on it and made it look as if it was lolling out of the mouth a little bit. And that's basically how I built the snakes. I mean, subdivisions are important, obviously, because it's got to deform nicely as it moves around the actual spline path there. So that's the key thing there. Make sure you get a good number of subdivisions in. I'm sure you know that anyway, but that's essentially what I did. But for anyone who doesn't know that stuff, that's what you need to do. So that's it, really. I mean, that's just a brief sort of look at how the snake might be constructed. It's just literally a case of tugging vertices until you form the shape that you want. And that's exactly what I did with them. And then obviously copied it 4 times and then did a little bit of work on the tails. If we go back into our tutorial, if we look at them, you can see that the tails are all slightly different. Again, it's a character thing. I just wanted each one to have its own sort of unique character. And that was pretty much how I achieved it. Other than that, I mean, I just knocked together some textures and put them on there. I mean, they're not even mapped particularly brilliantly, but it doesn't matter, to be quite honest, because we only see them from quite a far distance, so you're never going to know that they're not the most perfect of textures. But anyway, that's how the snakes were put together. So if we just go down here and hide our spline paths again, and just close that up. Now, the Expresso, quite literally, the first expression is exactly the same as it always has been. I've not changed anything in that first expression. It's absolutely identical, so there's nothing really more to say about that particular part of the algorithm here. If we look at the second ones, the only real change is to the range mapper here. Whereas before, we had an upper output value of 1000, we only now have 1, so it's 0 to 1, 0 to 1. The reason for that is because we're using the offset on the spline wrap, and this has replaced the position X of the green sphere. That was what that was originally, because we were going from 0 to 1000 centimeters across the screen, but we're not now. We're simply going from 0 to 1, and we're passing this to an offset on the spline wrap. So it's a case of going down to object parameter properties here and then choosing offset. That's all I've done with that particular node there for the spline wrap. So in other words, the offset value is a factor value of between 0 and 1 for the spline wrap's offset there. So they're the only changes that have been made in any of these. So all of the 5 first expressions are exactly the same. The 5 second ones, range mapper 0 to 1 instead of 0 to 1000 at the output stages, and then replace the green, pink, etc. spheres, position X, get rid of that, and just replace it with the spline wrap for the appropriate snake. So from SID, it will be this one here. That's been dragged into here. That's all it is. That's that first part of it dealt with. The second part, there's been a few changes in our expression down here. Now what I'm going to do, if I just nip back to tutorial number 5 and I click on my expression there. Now we were working originally, as I said, with position X of the various spheres. So we were saying we were going to compare the position X to greater than 999. That's what we were saying originally. And we were going to get the value from the position X, and we were going to divide our frames by that value in the divide. In our current tutorial, where we've got our snakes, all I've had to do is make a few minor changes to get this to do exactly the same thing. So I've labelled these up already. I've put our snakes spline wraps in. So I've got a spline wrap offset. We know that that's going to be between 0 and 1. So we're going to now compare. I'm comparing to greater than or equal to 0.999. So I'm working with 1,000th. That's all I'm interested in, a single thousandth of the spline wrap's offset value. Now, in order to make this work the way it did previously, when we come to dividing the time by the spline wrap here, I've had to multiply the output of the offset here by 1,000. So that's given us exactly the same values as we had in the previous expression. Even though we're looking at 0.999 here, we still want to look at a value of greater than or at least we want to divide the frames, I should say, by a value that's going to be a larger value. So we need it to be between 0 and 1,000 as opposed to a tiny little value in there. So that's what I've done there, and that's literally the only changes I've had to make. So you replace your sphere with a spline wrap, multiply the output by 1,000, put that into the bottom of the divide as opposed to the sphere's position X output. In the compare, you simply you're looking at greater than or equal to 0.999. It's as simple as that, and the rest of the expression is exactly the same as it was before. So if we look at all the rest of it, all of this is exactly the same. Nothing has changed. And that's pretty much it. And that basically concludes this tutorial, because that's really all there is to say about it. You know, it's quite a simple update to actually get that to go. I suppose the last thing we should do is show you the snakes slithering across the screen. So let's do that now. And away they go, slithering along their spline paths. They come into the end of the thing, and it tells us who's won, who's come second, third, fourth, fifth, as it did before. All works absolutely fine. And that just about completes this tutorial. So our next stage is to work on making the text for the positions of the snakes when they've come in and crossed the finish line, leap up the screen and move, as I mentioned before. So that's going to be our next port of call. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you on the next one very, very shortly.